some people will say that China's involvement with countries in Africa, some people will say that it's somehow exploitive. Others will say that no, that's not true. These deals that China's doing with Africa, they're mutually beneficial. What is your view?
Well, I think when the Chinese started out in Africa, they had a bad habit of trying to do everything with Chinese labor, and that inevitably aroused local animosities. They've learned. There are a lot of, I think there are a huge number of Africans now studying in Chinese universities, by the way, many on scholarship. Um, but the Chinese presence in Africa consists of different several different streams. The largest is actually small businesses, small Chinese businesses. There are over 3 million Chinese who have moved to Africa to open small businesses. So they're selling variety. They have little variety stores or dry goods stores and this sort of thing. And that, of course, generates a lot of trade because they tend to buy their products from China. The second is Chinese entrepreneurs. About 75% of the Chinese economy is private sector. And this private sector has gone abroad, and many are mining in in Africa. They're mining, they're producing manufactures. They are, for example, in Ethiopia, a major force in the industrialization of the country. So that's positive, I think, from the African point of view. There has been some significant Chinese infrastructure financing. An African railroad that will go across the continent from east to west. It's in prospect. The Kenyan railroads are now being extended to Uganda and the Great Lakes region of Africa. In response, the United States has offered railroad construction in Angola, the so-called Lobito line. Anyone who's ridden Amtrak and a Chinese train will wonder why the Angolans were enthusiastic about that. But President Biden went there to announce that deal, and there it is. I don't know what's happened to it in the Trump administration. In any event, I think any foreign presence in an economy has positive aspects and negative aspects. But the fact is that whereas the West offered aid on condescending grounds, the Chinese are offering economic partnership on a basis. And that is quite appreciated by many people. It has some problems, of course, labor problems, unrest. Nobody's perfect. And there are cultural differences between Africans and Chinese that are quite formidable. And I could talk about those if you want, but I'll stop here.
I'm going to ask a few more questions related to China, and then we'll transition to discuss Western Asia or the Middle East. A mutual friend said to me that, and let me know if this is correct or incorrect, but a mutual friend said to me that rather than the term multipolar world, you prefer the term multinodal world. Is that correct, Ambassador?
Yes, that is for the simple reason that a pole is a linear two-dimensional line with the points at the end. And that was a very good description of the bipolar order, both in the psychiatric sense and in the geometric sense, during the Cold War between Moscow and West Washington. But the world is now far more complicated, and a node is a three-dimensional point of connection. You can connect thick channels, thin channels. It can turn, it can move in space. It is three-dimensional at least, maybe four-dimensional. And I think it's a much more accurate description of what's happening. We're not dividing into poles, bilateral poles. Countries are emerging with multiple connections. So countries may have, let's say, take a major rising future great power Indonesia. Indonesia may have a conflict with China on fishing or South China Sea claims and even have military clashes over those. But at the same time, it may have a robust investment flow from China. It may have a great deal of trade with China, and it may side with China on international issues. We see complexity now in relationships. I just mentioned the Saudi defense minister, Khalid bin Salman, going to Tehran as part of a further rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia has a very good, strong relationship with the United States. It has a strong relationship with China, a strong relationship with Russia, a strong relationship with Germany, with Brazil, and an increasingly strong relationship with Malaysia and Indonesia. And of course, Japan and the Republic of Korea are very active there. So life is more complex in the new order than it was when everything centered on which feudal overlord, the United States or the Soviet Union, you look to for guidance and support.
Okay, I'm going to read a question from Rosemary Keene, who's a friend and an activist with Massachusetts Peace Action, where she's also a director. So Rosemary writes, Ambassador, do you think the U.S. military may have a more realistic and less belligerent understanding of China compared to our State Department? Or is there any division in the State Department, any group that sees that we could cooperate and collaborate with China rather than attempt to dominate?
A very good question. In my experience, the most bloodthirsty people are civilians because they don't risk their lives on the battlefield. They don't have the experience of having been in war. They believe war is a sort of video game in which the other side perishes and our side is left intact. The military have a far more realistic understanding of the limitations of the use of force and the dangers that it poses. So I can recall multiple meetings over the years that I served in the U.S. Foreign Service in the Situation Room at the White House when the civilians were advocating the use of force and the military were advocating caution and the use of diplomacy. Now, it may be that the military have an exaggerated notion of what diplomacy can accomplish, and ideally, the diplomacy is backed by the military, as well as operating as an inducement, a set of positive incentives for other countries to accept our view of where their interests lie and what they should do, as opposed to where they might have started out. Diplomacy is all about persuading others that they should see things the way you do and act accordingly in the way that you want them to act. That isn't accomplished very well by sending warships off their coasts. So that's one thing. The second, I cannot tell you what is happening inside the State Department. Basically, it is being mutilated by what I call the Department of Government incapacitation, not inefficiency, not efficiency. And the current Secretary of State doesn't seem to have much regard for the workforce there. Remember that this administration began by cutting the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which is part of the State Department, part of the Foreign Service apparatus. And it did so in a very peremptory and cruel way. It has also destroyed the U.S. Institute of Peace in a particularly brutal and, I think, utterly illegal way that I suspect will eventually be reversed by the courts, although there is now doubt about whether the administration is prepared to obey court orders. So there are people in the Foreign Service, in the State Department, who understand foreign cultures and who know what the opportunities are, as well as the perils of dealing with the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, others. But I have to say that in my experience, very often, even before this administration raised this practice to the normal level, to make it its normal level, very often when serious crises emerge, the first thing politicians do is throw the experts out of the room.
Mhm.